Hello, my name is Mae Foley, and I'm a sophomore nursing student at Fairfield University. I decided to take Intro to Contemporary World Literature because I knew it was time to look at other cultures besides my own, and I thought that literature was the perfect lens to do this through. I wanted to take advantage of going to college to learn about other cultures since I had never really been given that opportunity in high school. My school was very afraid to talk about sensitive topics like racism, politics, or immigration. Immigration has always been a major topic of discussion in America, especially recently, so I was confused as to why we never talked about it in school. It was a clear theme through the literature we discussed in this class, so I knew I wanted to analyze our texts and dive deeper into that issue through a new perspective. I'm also interested in exploring more authors of color, and many pieces of literature we read this semester are written by people of color, and they have very rich and interesting pasts. One of these authors is Jimmy Santiago Baca. He was born in 1952 in Santa Fe of Chicano and Apache descent. He was abandoned by his parents, and at 13 years old, he ran away from the orphanage where his grandmother had placed him. He was convicted on drug charges in 1973, and he spent 5 years in prison. And prison was where he read and began writing poetry. The specific poem I chose to analyze by him is titled Immigrants in Our Own Land. This poem is about immigrants who come to the United States to start a new life. They leave their country with high expectations, but in the end, those expectations are not met. Baca uses the experience of prison to paint the picture of how immigrants feel when they come to the United States. It shows the reader that the new country they are coming to will quite literally be their prison, which is the opposite of how immigrants first feel with, as he put it, dreams in their hearts looking for better days ahead. I feel that this poem represents so many immigrants that came to America looking for a new life. The beginning of the poem has a hopeful and happy tone, but it ends with a depressing one, and it shows that the author has basically given up, which represents the situation that so many immigrants have been in. And it is sad to read the progression of the narrator going from full of hope to basically accepting his fate of failure and his new life not living up to his expectations. I think that many immigrants reading this poem could relate to the way that he felt. A lot of the time, immigration is looked at as a fresh start and a new life for people, but this poem shows the reality of immigration and represents those immigrants who did not achieve the American dream, as people put it. Even though this poem was published in 1979, it is still completely relevant to modern-day America. When I was reading it, I was very sad to learn that this is when it was published, because this experience is still happening for so many immigrants in America today. This poem allowed me to view immigration from a new perspective. Being a white teenage girl from Connecticut, I had never had to worry about being seen as an American, and it saddens me that many immigrants that come to America, but they're never actually seen as a true American by their community because our country was literally built by immigrants. Another piece of literature by a person of color that impacted me was Identity Card by Mahmoud Darwish. Darwish was born in a village that was occupied and later razed by the Israeli army. Because they had missed the official Israeli census, Darwish and his family were considered internal refugees or present-absent aliens. He lived for many years in exile in Beirut and Paris. And in the 1960s, Darwish was imprisoned for reciting poetry and traveling between villages without a permit. Considered a resistance poet, he was placed under house arrest, and his poem Identity Card was turned into a protest song. This reminded me of Jimmy Santiago Baca's time in prison and how it strengthened him into an artist and a poet. Identity Card refers to the Palestinian identity card that is issued by the Israeli government to control the Palestinian people. Those with an identity card are not allowed to use Israeli streets, be in Israeli cities, or ride in Israeli cars. This poem explores how receiving this identity card actually causes one to lose their identity, and this was shown when Darwish stated, "I am a name without a surname." This poem outlines how one's identity can be held in things such as history, ancestors, land, and stories. Alienation is a major theme in this poem, and it is shown through Darwish's use of language. He tells us a story in a way that impacts the reader in a very powerful way, and it causes them to imagine the feeling of having your identity taken away from you. I feel that the themes of identity and alienation can be applied to many situations and groups of people, and the way that Darwish writes allows his audience to feel a connection to his situation. Repeating "I am an Arab" throughout the poem drills home the fact that Darwish is clutching onto his identity that is being stolen from him. The experience that Darwish writes about is a situation that many people experience every day, and these could include people that experience racism, sexism, xenophobia, transphobia, and so many other forms of discrimination. Many say that America is a great country of freedom and justice, which I totally agree with, but only to a certain point. This is true for someone who is privileged enough to experience it, but I don't believe that this is a privilege. I believe it's a human right that many humans in the US do not get to have. Living in America my entire life, I've had the privilege of living my life without worrying about being an alien in my own country. I know my freedoms and the things that I will never have to worry about the government doing to me or taking away from me, and I will never live my life in exile. And reading this poem made me realize that I need to stop viewing the rest of the world through the foggy filter of my own life, because what I have is rare and a privilege, and knowing that will allow me to see other situations for what they really are. One of my goals in life is to become a better global citizen, and reading literature like this will hopefully help me achieve that. A topic relating to this that I'm also passionate about is feminism and female artists being as recognized as men. Out of the 4 texts I chose to analyze, the one female author was Julia de Burgos. She was the eldest of 13 children born in Puerto Rico, and she grew up in Santa Cruz. She was hungry to learn, and she earned a teaching certificate at the University of Puerto Rico and worked as a teacher before she moved to New York and worked as a journalist. Following that, she moved to Cuba, where she pursued further studies at the University of Havana. Her poems engage themes of feminism and social justice, as well as themes relating to her family and her ancestors. Rio Grande de Luisa is a poem by her that is named after a river from her childhood. She goes through the poem beginning with her life as a child, through her adolescence, adulthood, and then goes into the remembrance of her ancestors at the end of the poem. De Burgos goes through the pain and violence that was suffered through by her family and her ancestors native to the island and the slaves along the river in Puerto Rico. She writes in a way that gives off a reflective and insightful tone, and I feel that the remembrance of her ancestors in this poem relates to immigration because it takes strength to move from one place that you and your family and your ancestors have been for so long. Immigration requires courage in order to pick up your life and move in order to give your family and your children a chance at a better one that you didn't have. This theme is similar to Baca's poem, and it is important to remember because it is representing the quiet majority of immigrants whose stories are not really heard, and they are overshadowed by the more cheerful ones that are easier to listen to by people like me. The final piece of literature I chose to analyze is by Franz Kafka. Kafka's past is unique in the way that he was impacted by his father. In one of his attempts at an autobiography, he attributed his failure to live and cut loose from his parental ties, as well as his failure to establish himself in a marriage and fatherhood, to his father, and he basically felt like his will had been broken by his father when he was growing up. This was extremely clear to me when I was reading one of Kafka's works titled The Metamorphosis, which is about Gregor Samsa, a traveling salesman who wakes up one day to find that he is transformed into a giant insect. His family is disgusted with him, especially when he is no longer to make money for their family, and Gregor eventually dies after knowing that he is a burden to his family and he just does not have the will to live anymore. The main character Gregor's change makes him literally and emotionally separate from his family members and humanity, which he refers to as imprisonment, and this reminded me of both Baca and Darwish and their time in prison. Symbols are seen throughout Metamorphosis, and this piece expressed and symbolized the anxieties and alienation felt by many people in 20th century Europe and North America. This related to identity card in the way that people felt like outcasts in their own home, like Darwish did in his own country. Metamorphosis connects to these themes, but it's also unique in the way that Gregor felt like he did not even belong in his home family. The way that Kafka portrayed this by turning himself into a bug left me feeling a big impact, and I feel like it was a very intelligent way to get his theme across to his audience without just plainly spelling it out to them. Taking this class taught me more skills than I was expecting to have by the end of the semester. It not only taught me how to read or watch something and analyze it, but it also taught me how important knowing more about the author is to understanding their poem or text. The emphasis put on learning about the authors and their lives really helped me to understand not just the piece that they wrote, but their reason behind it. and I feel that I have learned how to look at something from a point of view other than my own. Learning someone's background and reading something they wrote allowed me to practice putting myself in another person's shoes in order to understand something's purpose. I'm used to having the privilege of living my life easily compared to so many people in the United States, and I want to learn how to approach situations with others in mind, not just myself. I think having this skill will not only help me do well in college, but also in my career as a nurse after I graduate. Being a nurse means encountering numerous people who are really vulnerable, which will require me to be selfless and see beyond myself. I want to be a nurse who not only focuses on my patients' physical health, but also helps them heal their mind and their soul. And I do not only want to live for myself, but for others as well. And that begins with showing them understanding and empathy and approaching everything with an open mind and heart. And I can do this by putting myself in other people's shoes.